welcome everyone. Welcome to our second Ask Me Anything with the Osborne Group. I'm Bob Osborne. I'm principal of the Osborne Group, and I'm joined by my two colleagues, Karen Osborne and Laurel McCombs. Hello, guys. How are you guys today?
Good.
All right.
Good.
So this is our second one. It's kind of an experiment that we're trying. We do it the first Friday of every month at 1 p.m. Eastern, so you can keep an eye out for future Ask Me Anythings. But yeah, we're glad you're here. And why don't we dive in? Why don't we dive in with one of the questions that we received in advance?
Right. Karen, do you want to start?
Sure. So this is from someone who's unfortunately not able to be with us today, but she is going to watch the recording. And she said that as a manager, she's not sure how to balance remote workers, and they're going back into the office. They've reopened their office, and now she has to manage people remotely and in the office. And she's having trouble with resentments, like how come I have to come in? And she's managing, how do we keep the team, focused and working together and not spend all of her time on Zoom trying to, keep everybody focused. And, she wants them all to do their jobs. So I said, I will bring it up and ask our experts for any advice.
So what's the actual question?
There's some tips.
She should do?
There's some tips, some ideas for how she can manage remote workers and in the office workers. And I guess as a side thing, because she brought up this resentment question, but I guess that's a different question. Some people she's told they have to come in because of the nature of their jobs.
Yeah, I guess that's the place where I'd probably start. Is it's going to be really hard I think you acknowledge the pain points, right? Because I think that if the message is just do your job, and without acknowledgement of kind of the kind of underlying concerns and issues, then you just continue to build resentment potentially. So it feels like there's a first step that is clarity just around what are the differences in roles? Why does that dictate kind of different levels of requirements in terms of being in the office, and just getting really clear across the team in terms of roles and responsibilities. I mean, that's just a reality of a development team. And this is actually, it's interesting you bring this up, Karen, because I've actually had this come up with a couple of other clients, particularly throughout the pandemic, those handful of staff members who were the ones who had to keep going to the office to check the mail and get checks cashed. And, I think about poor Bob having to, just from our perspective at the Osborne Group, having to trudge through New York City and, while I sit comfortably in my apartment and, let him have to deal with that, so they're, but that's just a reality of our situation, right? That's Bob's role, and he's the one that does that. And, so I think from my perspective, that's where I would start. I think it's always better to have the tough conversation, get clarity, get understanding about why things are the way they are, and then try to get people to move forward from there. But that's probably where I'd start.
Yeah, and that it's not a favoritism issue. This is why it's backed by Bob. You know who this client is, so it's backed by, it's being clear about why I've chosen this, why I have laid out these rules, and maybe is there a way to renegotiate, or is there a way to have a hybrid, or because this was an issue even before COVID, where people wanted to work from home and not have a long commute.
Well, and it's going to continue to be an issue even once everyone can be back, right? Because I mean, all research and reports are telling us that there's going to be a whole kind of push back once offices reopen fully, that potentially you are going to have people who are going to say, I did this job perfectly well from home for the last year. Why do I need to come back to the office? So yeah, I think it's something that all managers probably need to take some time brainstorming and thinking about, what's the transition look like right now? And then what does kind of full back in the office look like, that's fair and equitable for everybody.
That's fair.
Yeah. I think those are excellent answers. And it puts me in mind also of our strategic negotiating and questions. And so maybe if people are interested in that, we're happy to mail that to you if you just write us an email at mail@theosborngroup.com. It's just good questions to ask your boss or your employees and just understand where they're coming from. And I think that helps too. So we have two questions in the Q&A. So first one is from Monica Cromer. What metrics can you recommend a director of development, including in job duties, when hiring a director of engagement for your college to assist with engaging alums and growing the pipeline for them to become donors? Weekly visits, etc. Thank you. You're our resident university expert, Karen. So I'm gonna.
Okay. I was gonna say Laurel's our metrics queen.
That's true too.
But I'm happy to start. One of the things that I think is so important in any institution, but certainly in colleges and independent schools, is that there are overarching goals that we all are trying to achieve. So if I'm in the alumni office and someone else is running development, that we have the same overarching goals. It's just that some of them I have a greater responsibility for, and someone else has the greater responsibility. So if it's a dollar goal, the development office is going to have the greater responsibility, but I, in the alumni office, has responsibility towards that too. So ideally, there is, as Laurel said to us and when she was talking about the other issue, is that there's clarity. What are we trying to achieve? What is our alumni program trying to achieve? Because that's where your metrics come from. They come from those goals. What am I trying to achieve? And then how will I measure that? So it shouldn't be arbitrary. It should be tied to. So for example, say that your office is trying to increase annual giving, middle donor annual giving, $1,000 to $10,000. And what role do I play in that as an alumni office? And so maybe it is, do I have those strategic conversations that I can provide information to the office? Maybe it is, do I do a few more stewardship events so that people know that, how much we all appreciate those of you in the audience watching us, or now physically, have given to the annual fund, and thank you. And here's an example of a student who you helped. And so I think you need clarity, and that from what are the goals, what are we trying to achieve, and then what should we measure?
And I'll just tack onto that. I think one of the things when I'm thinking about metrics development for anybody, but I think this, obviously can apply to this situation, is I always think about the three kind of metrics that we always want to make sure we have, that being outcome metrics. So what do we want to happen, right? So in Karen's example, we want to increase leadership annual giving from alumni, right? But then what are the process metrics that get us to that outcome? So we can measure weekly visits, but if we only measure weekly visits, which is a process outcome, then we're never to what end, right? So why are we making weekly visits? What's the point of that? So we need an outcome metric, but then we need process metrics, because we need to know what's contributing to whether or not we're seeing the outcome that we want to see. And then the third kind of metric that I think a lot of people don't measure are quality metrics. And the reason we don't tend to measure them is because they're harder to measure. But how do we try to find some ways to measure things like donor or alumni satisfaction, strength of relationship, right? So we talk a lot about the use of something called e-scores, so like engagement scores. Are there ways to kind of give ratings or scores to your various engagement activities as almost a qualitative metric of your activities? So think about that. It's kind of a well-rounded way to think about developing metrics, is looking at outcome, process, quality.
Yeah, and if you need something on e-scores, we have a little, just a quick explanation of how to use e-scores as both a way of measuring donor engagement, but also the efficacy of your different activities. Which of the things are we doing is resulting in the outcomes that we wanted. So e-scores from both of those perspectives can be very helpful to you.
Great. We have another question from Chantal de Alcuez. Hi, Chantal. Nice to see you. Our Devo team has been wanting to do a donor survey for a while and finally has a list of questions narrowed down. We're getting questions from our data team about how we will use the data and how it will be entered into the database. Can you offer best practice for interpreting and implementing and databasing the results of a donor survey? Thanks. So I would say, what we generally use is something outside of a database, which like a SurveyMonkey or some other service. And the reason that I like using that is because not everything that is in that donor survey you necessarily want to record in the database, so that there may be some specific things that you do want to record in the database. So something like a SurveyMonkey lets you slice and dice the data. It gives you can make charts, you can make a report to your donors from it very, very easily. You can interpret, it gives you lots of tools for interpreting the data and slicing and dicing it. So I kind of like to do it outside of my database and then think about what needs to be recorded within the database. So things like interests, if you're talking to them about like what parts of your program are they most interested in, like that's useful information. So you can segment. Stewardship preferences is a really great thing to record in the database as well. And then anything that sort of signals something unique about that particular respondent, that you might want to record if it's a higher capacity donor or higher capacity prospective donor, then you might want to record some of that as a contact note or something like that. But I wouldn't necessarily dump everything into the database, because what I find is you won't actually use it and it clutters things up. So I would record the information in the database that you normally would record. Again, preferences and specific information for donors that you might be cultivating from a relationship standpoint, as opposed to direct marketing and stewardship preferences and engagement preferences and things like that. Karen, Laurel, would you add anything to that?
I would just add that as you're kind of narrowing down those questions, one final thing to kind of check on the questions themselves is there any correlative data that we want to be able to look at later as part of the analysis? So for example, I did a big donor survey with a client and we segmented it by the way in which the donors typically received information from the organization. And so we actually had different survey links, whether they got it via email, whether they got it via mail, whether they were, and so we actually had different links based on kind of the segments of people that they wanted to look at and kind of get a sense of where these different groups were. So that way, on the back end, we were then able to compare and contrast responses to the survey based on those segments. So those are some of the things to think about before you send the survey out, is just, do we want to use maybe some different links, different ways of segmenting responses, so that we, if there are any key groups that we want to compare and contrast responses to, that we're gathering the data in a way that's going to let you do that.
And I would just like to add two things. How important it is to follow up after the survey. Bob said, if you have some reports and you could report to the donors that this is what we found out, that's critical. You turn it into a strategic initiative that, thank you for this information, and here's what we learned, and here's what we're thinking about doing with it. What do you think? So close that loop and not let it just be an email. Let it be a productive interaction. And then I just want to go back to, you said that you've all narrowed down the questions. The questions are the most important part. So you want to make sure that you are asking questions in a way that lets you both do, quantify as well as qualitative questions. And you don't want to ask things like, how many times a year would you like to hear from us?
Right.
You don't want to ask, do you want, you don't ask any questions that you don't want the answer to. So what do you think we should be doing about? Those are bad questions. Here's what we're considering. Which of these two ideas do you like best? That's a better question than what should we do? And then, when you're writing the questions, you're not asking them about things that don't matter. Did you enjoy the event? Did you like, with the colors, the right colors? You want to make sure that your questions are tied to your goals.
Absolutely.
And tied to burning questions and decisions that maybe you're struggling to make. Find that's where, and the great thing, to Karen's point, is if the questions are actually tied to like actual real decisions, and we all have a lot of those right now. I feel like I think every client conversation I have right now, we're talking about pivoting and transitioning and what do we do now. I think so everyone has all of these questions about what are the right things to do as we come out of the pandemic. Ask some of those questions, because then, to Karen's point, you have something really specific that you can go back to those donors and say, we heard you, we listened to you, and this is why we made this decision. And that's a really powerful stewardship communication to them.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's see. Well, we encourage you again to continue to put some questions in the Q&A or in the chat. But in the meantime, do we have any other questions that we had received in advance?
Yes. So we had another question that about donor strategy, which I have, and the reason I like this question is because I hear it from so many people. But the question is, I have to get out the door or visit on Zoom or be in touch. Everyone's saying, be in touch, be in touch, be in touch. One of the messages that we hear from the Osborne Group is be in touch with a strategy. But okay, I mean, this is time consuming, not sure what that means exactly. If you could just talk a little bit about donor plans, that would help me and my team. She's a new Major Gift team leader.
Well, I guess I can dive in. So, I mean, there's a lot to be said about donor plans, so I'm going to try to think about the most relevant one. So, one I would say is have them and write them down and have them be recorded in some way. And I think this is actually maybe in some ways the most important part, because whether your strategy is a good strategy or not, having some strategy is almost always better than having no strategy. And if you don't write it down, then I would argue you probably don't actually have a strategy. Like if it's not something that you can record in some way and have some accountability attached to it and an understanding of who's doing what and when and what you're trying to achieve, then again, it's also likely to be a bad strategy. So I think 90% of this is being thoughtful about what it is that you're trying to achieve, like understanding what you're trying to do, like why am I doing what I'm doing? Whereas I think we often tend to just take people out to lunch or go get on a call on Zoom with them these days and just tell them about all the interesting things that we're doing as an organization, which is not the same as having strategy. Am I frozen?
No.
Okay. and just be, was I frozen? No.
Good.
Okay.
You're good. Roll along.
We're just gonna keep plowing ahead. Okay, I keep plowing ahead. And by writing it down, then again, it forces you to think about it and to really understand what it is you're trying to do and put a date to it. And I think that's a lot of this. I think good strategy is maybe a slightly different discussion, and we can talk a long time about that. But I would say, good strategy is active. It involves engagement of some kind. It's not just pushing information at people, but it is giving them some way of actively engaging with your organization, your ideas, your vision. And I think if you kind of follow those rules, you'll be 95% of the way there. I mean, there's lots of nuance to this, and there's lots of art to this, and science, and we love talking about it. But I would say, just in this forum, the very quick version is good strategy. A lot of it is just discipline, doing it, writing it down, and being thoughtful about it, and try to make it as engaging as you possibly can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll just, because I'm always the Debbie Downer when it comes to process and systems, is just having an actual process for how those strategies get implemented and filling in the gaps in strategy. Because I think what happens a lot is people create donor strategy that is, something like, have a meeting with our CEO and the donor. But the reality is there's like 5 things that have to happen before that meeting can happen, right? Like the CEO's executive, somebody has to call the CEO's executive assistant and ask her to put it on his calendar. And somebody has to call, like I think why people tend to get bottlenecked with implementing strategy is because they don't think about all the little tasks that have to get done to get there.
Yeah. And I would just also add, some of you have heard me say this before, but my mother-in-law had this great expression, and she'd say, well, I talked it over with myself and I decided I was right. And that is what happens when we do strategy alone. We talk it over with ourselves and we think, oh, this is so good, but it is always better, always better. And I've been doing this for 40 some odd years, and I still have better strategy when I talk it over with Bob and Laurel than when I decide it all by myself. It's just always better. Even if they
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Even if we don't all know the person that we're talking about, it's going to trigger something. It's going to trigger an idea. So we really encourage strategy sessions. And that's a great place to follow up on Laurel's point. Yep. So someone says in the strategy session, I really need the CEO to meet with my donor. And then the Laurel in your office says, okay, but let's think through what that's going to take. And maybe there's something you could do with George before, because this is going to take at least 3 weeks for us to get this all, So is there something you need to do with George before then? And so again, having group discussion makes a big difference.
And having a designated Laurel in your office, right? I think that's the other thing is I say this to clients all the time, is who's your team nag? Like who's the person who's just like, all right, hey, we were supposed to get this done last week and it's not done. I hate to say it, but somebody's got to have that role, right? Okay, so
we have 2 more questions and we have 5 minutes, so we gotta move faster through these, folks. Okay, ready? From Sue Gobb. So we like talking about this stuff. I think it shows. Do you have written criteria for major donor classifications for A, B, and C to help guide the team?
No. Are you talking about ratings? Are you talking about capacity ratings? Could you let us say yes or no in your chat?
Why don't we come back to that question, and then you can let us know, Sue, what you mean by like A, B, and C with a right. Is that a way that you rank your your prospective donors or not? But we'll go to Andy Robinson's question, and then we'll come back to your question, Sue.
Andy Robinson, such a fan.
Yes. After years of training boards to raise money, some success, some less than success, the baseline issues remain. Board members are volunteers, they have lives outside of the organization, and staff have little leverage over their behavior and follow through. I'm on the verge of giving this advice. Give up on your board. Look for fundraising models that don't rely on board engagement. Do you want to talk me off the cliff, or shall we jump together?
Oh my goodness, that would make a great blog for us to write.
Yes. Oh man, Andy, I feel like we could do a whole webinar just on that one question.
You need your board. You need a board that's engaged. If you have a board that is lazy or not philanthropic or not fully committed to the organization, then you need a change plan. You need an 18-month change plan. Your organization deserves an engaged, generous, inspiring board. And no matter where you live and no matter what kind of organization you are, those people are out there. Do not settle. The people behind you, all those people that you are responsible for, all of those people you serve, they deserve a great board. And going back to the question about rankings, she said it was about ratings, and we could send her something on that. ABC is not a good way to rank people. You need a little bit more information, and there's some easy free ways that you can do that. And then there are ways that you can refine it that cost money, but there's lots of easy free ways that you could, and we could just
Yeah, if you send us an email at mail@theosborngroup.com, we can send you something. Yeah, I would agree with you, Karen, on the board question. You know, and we're big believers in strategically composed boards, and that can look like a lot of different things. And it doesn't mean that everyone on your board has to look the same and have the same role and all have money, or, you know, I mean, lots of organizations now are looking at, you know, models that are more focused on the communities that they serve and the like. And we think that all makes sense as long as, again, your board is in alignment with whatever your goals are as an organization. But you do need a board because they really are your reach into the community, however you define that. You know, the community you serve, the funding community, other like-minded people. Without it, I find that there's really very much a ceiling on how much money you can raise without the use of your board. And you'll do it in a way that's probably going to be very foundation dependent, I would say, is also a tendency. Like, that's the thing you can kind of do without your board a lot of times. And that has a lot of its own problems and challenges that will come down the road. It's not as a stable source of funding, and it's, you know, there's lots of issues with philanthropy. So I think it's really important, and it's just, to Karen's point, it's finding the right people. There are people out there that are going to be good and be on your board, and you deserve that board. And I think, right, when you're frustrated with your board, it has a lot more to do with who's on your board than the concept of the board itself.
Well, and I think just to find my little piggyback too is just that, you know, I think the next revolution kind of in board development is not that we don't need boards, but just the way we think about who should be on our boards. And I think for a long time it was about C-suite level, you know, wealth generators, you know, that was kind of, and you know, and you know, you'll say to people, well, maybe you should look at, you know, some other group of people, and people say, well, oh, but we really need to get these C-suite level. And I'll say, well, but what are those people doing for you now? How's that working for you? Right? To just focus on people who have wealth, but aren't passionate or connected to your mission. And that's why they're not doing anything. Like, I'll take somebody who is a middle manager, but is passionate and willing to go out and advocate for my organization any day, right? So I think that's the big question is not whether or not we need a board, but we really need to just throw a lot of stuff at the wall in terms of what we've traditionally thought of as the right people to be on our boards.
And also just ask yourself this question: am I trying to get the wrong people to do the right thing? Or am I trying to get the right people to do the right thing? If you have the right people, then you can help teach them and get them stronger in the things that you need them to do. But if you have a board of the wrong people, then you're just wasting your time. How can I get this board to, you know, raise money for me? Well, if they don't love you, if you're not a priority, if they hardly come to meetings, the answer is you can't.
Right.
So, so we've got to get the right people, and it's doable.
So hopefully we talked you off the edge, Andy.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us again on these first Fridays for Ask Me Anything. We're gonna keep doing them. So think of your questions between now and then. And thank you for joining us. And we look forward to talking to you all again in a month. Stay safe and stay well, everyone. Bye-bye.
Right.